The morning after the flood was eerily quiet. The storm that had raged through the night was gone, leaving behind a world that no longer looked like the one James and Diep had known. The sky was pale gray, heavy with the scent of mud and broken wood. The air was thick, damp, and strangely hollow, as if even the wind was too tired to move. James stood in the middle of what used to be their home. Now it was nothing more than a heap of debris half buried in brown water. Pieces of furniture floated aimlessly, and the small garden Diep once tended so carefully was now just a smear of mud and shattered leaves. He could still hear the echo of her scream from the night before, the sound of fear and loss tearing through the rain. Diep sat on a piece of driftwood nearby, her hands trembling as she stared at the wreckage. Her clothes were soaked and torn, her hair tangled with dirt and rain. There were no tears left in her eyes, only an emptiness that broke James's heart. She whispered, almost to herself, "It's all gone. James, everything we built, gone." He turned to her, his throat tight. "We're still here," he said softly. "That's something no flood can take away." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his chest. He looked around, the silence of destruction, the broken world around them, and wondered if survival alone was truly enough. A stray bird fluttered past, its feathers dripping with water, landing on a cracked branch nearby. It shook itself, fragile yet alive. For some reason, that small movement made Diep lift her head. Her eyes followed the bird as it struggled to balance, its tiny wings trembling, but it did not fall. James watched her face, saw the faintest spark return to her expression. The flood had taken their home, their belongings, their plans, but maybe not their hope. In that moment, under the dull morning light, he realized something quietly miraculous. They were still breathing, still together, still capable of beginning again. He took a step toward her, his shoes sinking into the wet earth. "Diep," he said gently, reaching out his hand. "Come on, let's go see what's left of the village. Maybe we can help someone." She hesitated, then placed her trembling hand into his. The warmth of his touch cut through the cold that had wrapped around her heart. Together, they began to walk, their footsteps slow and heavy, but steady. All around them was ruin, but within that ruin, something fragile yet powerful stirred. It wasn't just survival. It was the quiet, stubborn beginning of hope. And as James glanced at Diep walking beside him, her eyes filled not with despair but determination. A thought crossed his mind like a whisper from heaven. Could this be the beginning of a miracle? The village lay in ruins. Houses that once stood proudly side by side were now nothing more than broken roofs and twisted metal. The familiar dirt paths had turned into muddy streams, and the cries of frightened children echoed through the air. James and Diep walked carefully, their hands still clasped, their hearts heavy yet strangely calm. Everywhere they looked, there were faces tired, tear-streaked faces of people who had lost everything. A mother knelt beside the wreckage of her home, calling out her child's name. An old man sat in silence, staring at the water where his small shop once stood. The world had been washed clean, but not in the way anyone would wish. Without saying a word, Diep broke away from James and ran toward a little boy standing alone by the roadside. His clothes covered in mud, the child's lips were blue, and he was shivering violently. "Hey, it's okay," Diep whispered, wrapping her arms around him. The boy didn't speak, but his small hands clung to her tightly. James watched her, his chest tightening. Even after everything she'd lost, her first instinct was to help. She didn't care about her ruined dress or her shaking knees. All she cared about was that someone else was safe. In that moment, he saw something almost sacred in her kindness, a quiet strength that no flood could ever drown. He joined her, kneeling beside the boy. "Let's take him to the shelter," James said softly. "They might have blankets." Together, they carried the child through the ruins to what was left of the community hall, a cracked building, but still standing. Inside, people huddled together, sharing food, whispering prayers. Someone handed Diep a dry cloth. She gently wiped the mud from the boy's face, humming a lullaby through her trembling lips. James stood nearby, watching her. The light through the broken roof fell across her face, soft and golden, despite the ruin around them. It struck him then, even in the aftermath of destruction, she was hope personified. She was the miracle he had been too blind to see. Later, as the evening sun struggled to break through the gray clouds, Diep sat beside him outside the hall. "Do you think things will ever be the same again?" she asked quietly. James looked at her for a long time, then shook his head. "No," he said honestly. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we're meant to build something new, something stronger." Diep smiled faintly, resting her head against his shoulder. The air was still cool and heavy, but somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. For the first time since the flood, James felt his chest rise with a quiet, certain peace. The storm had destroyed everything they owned, but it had also stripped away their illusions, leaving behind what truly mattered: compassion, courage, and love. And as the last rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, touching Diep's face, James couldn't help but whisper to himself, "Yes, this is the beginning of a miracle." Days passed, the muddy roads began to dry, and the sound of hammering slowly replaced the silence of loss. The village was waking up again. From the ashes of destruction, small acts of courage bloomed: someone rebuilding a fence, a group of women cooking rice for the hungry, children laughing again under the weak sunlight. James stood among the ruins, sleeves rolled up, his hands blistered from lifting wood and clearing debris. He had once led meetings in glass-walled offices, surrounded by luxury and certainty. Now, he worked with dirt beneath his nails and sweat on his brow, and yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt alive. Diep moved gracefully among the people, her gentle voice carrying calm wherever she went. She organized food for the elderly, helped mend torn clothes, and even gathered flowers that somehow survived the flood to brighten the temporary shelters. Her kindness was contagious. People who had nearly given up began to smile again when she passed. One morning, as the sun rose over the muddy horizon, James paused from his work. He saw her by the riverbank, washing clothes in the shallow water. The light caught her hair, turning it to gold. She looked up, caught him watching, and smiled, a small, tired smile, but filled with warmth. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The woman standing before him wasn't just the girl he loved, she was the reason. He believed they could rise again. The flood had taken their home, their comfort, and their peace, but it had given him clarity. Love wasn't about perfection or safety, it was about standing together when the world collapsed. Later that day, he approached her with a quiet voice. "Diep," he said, his tone almost shy, "I've been thinking, maybe we don't rebuild what we had before. Maybe we build something new together with everyone." Diep looked at him, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and hope. "A new beginning?" she asked softly. He nodded, that double quotes, "Yes. A place where we help one another. A place built on kindness, not just bricks." She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Then let's do it. Let's start today." And so they did. Brick by brick, smile by smile, the miracle began to take shape, not from the heavens, but from the hearts of people who refused to give up. The flood had washed away the old, but in its wake, it left behind something pure: unity, compassion, and love reborn. That night, as the stars returned to the sky for the first time since the storm, James stood beside Diep, watching the flickering light of lanterns across the rebuilt village. He reached for her hand, and she squeezed his back gently. "We made it through the darkness," she whispered. "Yes," James replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "And maybe the miracle wasn't surviving the flood. Maybe it's learning how to live again after it." Weeks later, the village was no longer silent. Laughter returned, roofs were rebuilt, and the smell of freshly cooked rice drifted through the air. Flowers began to bloom again in the muddy soil. Small, fragile, but alive, nature itself seemed to whisper that healing had begun. James and Diep stood before what used to be their home. Now a simple wooden house stood in its place, humble but strong. The walls were still rough, the floor unfinished, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and the help of neighbors who had become family. Diep looked around, her eyes soft with wonder. "I never thought we could start again," she said quietly. James smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Neither did I. But maybe miracles don't come from the sky, Diep. Maybe they come from people, from us." She leaned into him, listening to the sound of the river nearby, no longer violent, but calm and steady. Children's laughter echoed in the distance. Life, once again, was moving forward. As the evening sun bathed the village in golden light, James took a deep breath. "The flood took everything," he said softly, "but it gave us something greater and new reason to live." Diep looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Then this really is the beginning of a miracle," she whispered. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and together they watched the horizon where the river flowed gently, carrying away the past and bringing with it a promise of tomorrow. The world had changed, and so had they. From the ruins, love had risen again, and that, above all, was the truest miracle of life. The story of James and Diep is not simply about surviving a natural disaster. It is a profound reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet strength of love. When the flood came, it destroyed their home, their possessions, and the life they had built together. In a single night, everything familiar was washed away. Yet, from that emptiness, something far greater emerged, a renewed understanding of what it truly means to live. At first, despair ruled their hearts. Surrounded by ruins, James and Diep felt the weight of loss pressing down on them. But when they began helping others, offering food, comfort, and hope, they realized that compassion is stronger than destruction. The flood had taken much, but it could not take away kindness. In giving to others, they found healing for themselves. James, once a powerful CEO used to control uncertainty, discovered humility. He learned that no amount of wealth or status could shield him from nature's fury. But he also learned that real power lies in the courage to start again, even when all seems lost. Diep, gentle yet unwavering, showed that love is not measured by what we have, but by what we give. Her kindness became the seed of a miracle, one that grew quietly amid the mud and ruin. Through their story, we see that life is fragile, yet endlessly capable of renewal. Tragedy strips us bare, but it also reveals who we truly are. When we lose everything, we begin to see clearly the things that matter most: love, faith, and the will to keep going. The flood that nearly destroyed them became the turning point that brought them closer, not just to each other, but to the essence of humanity itself. The true miracle was not the survival of their bodies, but the rebirth of their hearts. They learned that even in the darkest storm, there is light, if we choose to see it. Hope, like a seed, beneath the water, waits patiently for the sun, and when the storm passes, it blooms stronger than before. In the end, James and Diep's story reminds us that no matter how deep the flood or how dark the night, love and compassion are the forces that will always lead us back to life.